Be sure that you're keeping them moist. If you're going to make a mistake, keep them a little bit too moist rather than letting them get too dry. They are not as cold hardy as bougainvilleas. Now, a lot of people grow hibiscus in the ground and they get away with it. But if you're going to do that, mulch them heavily in the fall and expect that they will freeze back. Unless we have an extraordinarily hard winter, they will come back, even if they freeze down. But you want to keep that lower 6 inches of the plant really well protected if you're gonna have them come back out the next year. As far as varieties and colors, there's not much in the blue shades in hibiscus, but boy, you pick just almost any other color of the rainbow and you will find them. There are some that are pure white, there are some that are red, there are oranges, there are yellows, there's some that are violet colored, there's some that are just incredible mixtures of color. I can see how people really get hooked on hibiscus. I don't know if Patrick just did bring any of the more interesting ones in, or if we're getting low on some of the really fancy varieties. But hibiscus, I mean, the flowers can easily be, on the tropical ones, the flowers can easily be 5 or 6 inches in diameter. On the mallows, and I guess we ought to talk a little bit more about them in a minute, these flowers can be 10 inches across. If you're really out to impress the neighbors, you literally will get a dinner plate sized flower on these things. But the tropical hibiscus, showy because they bloom all the time, get very few problems, although you will see aphids on them every now and then. And that's one thing about tropical hibiscus. Don't spray them unless you absolutely have to. They are very sensitive plants, and any spray that has much oil in it will totally defoliate them. You'll find if you ever, oh, heaven forbid that you're off reading chemical labels, but virtually every chemical that you see out there will say don't spray on hibiscus, because they really will defoliate them in a hurry. Now, the only thing that ever shows up on these guys are aphids. And if you have good air circulation and if you've not stressed the plants, aphids are not usually a problem. If the aphids do occur, little parasitizing wasp, if you ever see a bunch of aphids on there and you're tempted to do something about it, study the colony of aphids and see if you see what look like any little round balls mixed in with the aphids that are up and down the flower stems. If you were to look real carefully at those with a magnifying glass, it would look like an aphid that you'd stuck an air pump into and blown up into a little round basketball. You'll see the feet sticking out in all directions and the aphid's dead. What has happened is there's a little wasp that has parasitized that aphid, has laid an egg into it. And if you were to take that and look at it under a dissecting microscope, you'd see a developing wasp larva inside of the aphid. And so usually if you have an aphid colony show up, it'll just be a matter of days before these little wasps, in an organic program, we're not spraying toxic stuff all the time, these little wasps, and the little wasp itself is only about this big, will show up and will parasitize the aphid. So rarely do you ever have to do anything, and at most, just take your hose and blast the aphids off. The aphids, when they start sucking the juice of a plant, they kind of lock their jaws into the stem. You hit them with a stream of water, it blows the aphids away, and the jaws are still left behind on the plant. Kids love that kind of thing. But anyway, so usually you totally eliminate the aphids with just a burst of water. But the parasitizing goes on to a great degree, and it's really, they're sort of self-cleaning plants. If you have a continuing aphid problem on hibiscus, you're doing something wrong. You're keeping them too dry, you're not giving them enough sunlight. Something is stressing the plant or it wouldn't have that many aphids on it. Yes?
I've got a variegated leaf hibiscus. The flowers on them are not as large as my others. Is that
That's
the
correct.
nature of it?
Yeah, that's
okay.
the nature of it. The other thing I was going to tell you, I don't want to talk about that in just a second, but hibiscus are one tropical that will get by with half-day sun. They need at least a few hours of sun, but if you give morning sun and afternoon shade, they seem to do really well. Some of the more colorful varieties, if you leave them out in the hot, hot, hot sun, the flower will actually sunburn, even though the plant takes it real well. But so they're one plant that you can get by with growing them in not quite as much full sun. Now, there are two forms of the variegated hibiscus that you mentioned. They're different species. They're Hibiscus cooperi, and the one that we've grown for a long time was green and white with just a little bit of pink in it, and then it has a red flower. There is a new one out now that's called Red Hot that has an intense pinkish color to the leaves along with some green color. The flowers are not as showy on the variegated hibiscus, but the foliage is gorgeous all the time. You'll sometimes see them grown in hanging baskets, although they certainly will outgrow the hanging basket given a season to grow. But they're just incredibly showy. Those, the more sun you give them, the more colorful the leaves become. But the smaller and less brilliantly colored flowers, that's just the nature of Hibiscus cooperi. Anything about hibiscus? Any other questions? Anybody have problems growing them for any reason? Yes, ma'am.
I recently moved back here and bought a house where they hadn't watered for like 6 months. And so that might be the problem, but I have a hibiscus that's, it's at least 8 feet tall, but it looks really scrappy. And it's only having very random, once in a great while, a single bloom.
Well, fertilize it, water it, trim it back if you want to, and it will go back to its original glory.
Okay, so it would be okay to trim it either?
Absolutely. I would begin by fertilizing and watering. When you see a little bit of new growth appearing on the tip of the branches, that's telling you, hey, my roots are in good shape again. Cut it back at that time and it'll come out very quickly.
Okay, yeah, it is growing, it just looks scrappy.
Yeah.
My husband wanted me to dig it out. He said, I think it's something.
Yeah. Cut it back and enjoy it. Cut it back and enjoy it.
Bob, one thing, can you tell me the name of it? It's a hibiscus tree, and it has long boughs, and at the end of each bough is one big flower. I've seen it, but I don't know.
Are they yellow or
Pink.
different colors?
Pink.
That's not a special variety. That is a tree. That is a plant that has merely been trimmed to make it tree-like. They refer to that as standards, and you can take all of these, kind of like a crepe myrtle, you stake it and cut all the lower limbs off, and it would grow up that way, and it's just a way of trimming them to grow. It's not really a special variety. I do want to mention the mallow types, and there are a lot of different ones. When Mr. Moy was down at the Botanical Gardens, he worked on developing a especially large flowered one they call the Moy Grande. And but these things are so much fun to grow if you want to impress your friends with the flower size. The disadvantage to the mallow types is that you basically have 3 color choices: white, pink, or rose. That's about it. There's also a white one with a rose center, but you will not see the oranges or the yellows or any of that sort of color. So very limited color selection in the mallows. But when they come into bloom, I mean, if your blooms aren't this big around, fertilize them a little bit more, and people will really think you're some incredible gardener. They freeze to the ground, never require any winter protection, and very, very easy to grow, but again, don't give you quite the diversity of the tropicals. Yes?
What is that plant with that kind of foliage? What is it called? The mallow?
This is quite possibly one of Mr. Moy's. This is probably a Moy Grande. There's also a Lord Baltimore that is similar to this, but has a little bit wider leaves. And then there's a Lady Baltimore, which is just a slightly different color. But this is either, I don't think these leaves are wide enough for the Lord or Lady Baltimore. I think it's probably Moy Grande.
How much water do they want?
These, like all hibiscus, water them thoroughly when they're dry on the surface. The original species that these were derived from were actually bog plants, came out of South Carolina. So they will tolerate a little bit more water, but they're also, hibiscus are in the cotton family. If you let them get alternately too wet and too dry, you can get cottony root rot with them. But I just water them thoroughly when they're dry on the surface, water them again.
Can you do anything about that cotton root rot?
Yes. If you suspect, well, once you've got it established, no, you probably can't save a plant that has cottony root rot. But if you're ever going to plant something back into the soil where you've had cottony root rot problems, there's a product called Actinovate. It's a naturally occurring bacteria which produces an actinomycin type product, which tends to kill out the cottony root rot. You'll never see cotton root rot in places with acidic soils. Cotton root rot cannot grow in Alabama or Mississippi or places where the soil is more acidic. But here where our soils are very alkaline, it may be a problem with some plants. But the Actinovate